Do you want to play a build that does exceptional damage with an easy rotation, does all of its damage from range, can be tweaked to provide all the amazing Mesmer utility, and has an even easier version that still outdamages some other classes' full DPS builds?
Oh my.
Then buckle up. Today we're covering your new main DPS class, Condi Virtuoso. There's a lot of things that go into what makes a DPS class good in Guild Wars 2. First, how much damage can it do? How easily can it apply that damage? How simple is its rotation? How does it help your team and make their lives easier? And how forgiving is it to play? There are builds that do omega damage, but have complicated rotations and are super frail. There are some that don't offer much to your team and punish you heavily if you make mistakes. Condi Virtuoso is not one of those builds. Here we have a high damage build that's super simple to play, very forgiving with 2 blocks and insanely long distortion baked into the build for free, can swap out its skills to provide insane levels of breakbar damage or whatever extra utility a fight needs. It's also fully ranged, so you can safely walk out of dangerous mechanics while still attacking the boss. All these things combined make this a build that you can take into basically all endgame content and give yourself the best chance to perform well on. There's also a ton of room to tweak this build to make it more survivable or to give it an even simpler damage rotation. The biggest change for Virtuoso compared to other Mesmer specializations is that your clone mechanic is now replaced by blades. Where your clones would be tied to a specific enemy and would disappear when that enemy died, your blades will stick around when you're out of combat and will even regenerate over time. Your shatter skills also change. Instead of causing your clones to explode on enemies, your shatter skills will launch your stocked blades at enemies for different effects, depending on which shatter skill you use. An important thing about this build is that the vast majority of its damage comes from bleeding, like a horrendous number of bleeding stacks. Lots of this bleeding is applied on critical hits as well, so whereas most Condi builds will just load up on Viper's gear to give them the most condition damage and duration across a wide range of conditions, this build is designed to do 2 things: max out bleeding duration and max out critical chance. You'll see how this plays out when we chat about the gear and rune choices. Today we'll be looking at 2 main variants of the Condi Virtuoso. These will be centered around swapping out one of the trait lines. Everything else is very similar. The first and higher damage version of the build will be using the Dueling trait line, which places a higher focus on summoning phantasms and uses a bit more of a hybrid damage profile. What I mean by that is your damage will have a bit more of a split between power and condition damage, rather than focusing solely on condition damage. This version also has a slightly more complicated rotation, although it's not even really a rotation, it's really just a few more extra buttons to press. For all this extra effort, you do get slightly higher damage, around an extra 10% or so. For the Chaos version, we swap out the Dueling trait line for Chaos. Chaos is a more defensive trait line and also shifts the focus away from summoning phantasms as a main source of damage. This means you can more freely swap your offhand weapon around, or just not worry about summoning phantasms at all. This does come with a drop in damage, although it's still one of the higher damage, low intensity builds you can find in the game at the moment. This version does rely more on receiving regeneration from your subgroup to reach its full potential, so make sure you keep that in mind. We'll go through the traits in more detail later, so stick around. No matter the build variant, you'll always be taking Dagger as your main hand weapon. The Dagger is an entirely ranged weapon and will allow you to stock blades as fast as possible. This means that you can shatter more often and do more damage. Flying Cutter is a 1200 range attack that pierces enemies, and for every 3 hits, will cause an additional flurry of damage. Blade Call will launch 3 daggers in front of you in a cone shape. If at least one of these blades hits an enemy, you'll stock an additional blade for your Bladesongs. Unstable Bladestorm will launch a storm of daggers in front of you that moves forward and damages enemies. It will also launch blades outwards for additional damage. For the Dueling version, you'll want to take Sword and Focus as your offhand weapons. These will give you the highest damaging phantasms possible, as well as provide some amazing utility. On Sword, Illusionary Riposte will give you access to a channeled block and will also allow you to shoot out a bolt that dazes enemies. Phantasmal Swordsman will obviously summon your Sword Phantasm, which deals outstanding damage and also grants you 8 stacks of might if it hits. Note that this skill attacks using Blurred Frenzy, the Mesmer Sword 2 skill. This is an important point for later. For Focus, we have Temporal Curtain, which creates a wall that gives you and your allies swiftness when you cross it, and it also cripples enemies. You can activate it again to pull 5 enemies together. This is an amazing skill for grouping up enemies for your team to burst down. Get familiar with this skill, you're going to be using it a lot. Phantasmal Warden will summon a phantasm that attacks 12 times, applies a whole load of vulnerability, and even blocks enemy projectiles. For the Chaos version, you can take any offhand weapon you prefer depending on what utility you need. However, the highest DPS option will typically be Torch. The Prestige will stealth you, blind enemies, and remove a condition. When you come out of stealth, you'll burn nearby enemies. This is an instant cast skill, so you can just spam it off cooldown for some extra damage. Phantasmal Mage will apply conditions and daze foes. It's not really used for its damage, but it's great as some clutch breakbar damage. Now for our Bladesong, formerly Shatter skills. Our Bladesong skills are some of the most important skills on this build. There's so much damage and utility baked in here, we need to talk about it. Bladesong Harmony will simply fire all your stock blades at your opponent. Great damage. Bladesong Sorrow will fire your blades and inflict confusion on your target. This is your most important Bladesong skill for damage. Bladesong Dissonance will combine your blades and daze your target, which is excellent breakbar damage. Bladesong Distortion was only added to the game in October of last year and has caused this build to transcend the mortal realm by giving you 1 second of distortion for each blade you have stocked. That's up to 5 whole seconds of distortion. Blade Turn Requiem will block attacks for 2 seconds and damage foes around you. Quite useful for a bit of extra damage, and yet another spicy block for us to use. In keeping with the simplicity of this build, our default skill loadout is going to be full of Signets. Signet of the Ether heals you for a small amount, and when used, recharges all your Phantasm skills. This becomes very important when we get to the rotation section of the video. The Signet of Illusions will passively generate a clone, a blade in this case, every few seconds. When you activate it, it will recharge all of your shatters. The active skill here is the main reason we include it in the build. Ideally, you want to use it when you've used up all charges of your F1 and F2 Bladesongs. This allows you to use your Bladesongs more often and recharge them between encounters. The passive from Signet of Midnight will increase your condition duration, the main reason we include it in the build. You can activate it to blind nearby enemies and stealth yourself, but it's really just here for the passive. The passive from Signet of Domination will increase your overall condition damage. Again, this is the main reason it's here. In a pinch, you can also activate it for some extra CC if you need. Try and use this as a last option for breakbar damage though, given it will cut into your DPS if you use it. 1000 Cuts is an amazing damage skill that shoots out blades in a line in front of you. These hit 10 times, pierce through enemies, and is even unblockable for good measure. If you want to swap out a skill for some extra utility, swap out Signet of Illusions first. It's the weakest skill on your default loadout, and it's by far the easiest one to replace. Some good alternatives include Rain of Swords, which will give you some nice AoE damage, and if you're new to the build and performing the rotation a little bit slower, will likely give you higher DPS than Signet of Illusions. Blink and Portal are great for some extra mobility. Feedback will give you amazing projectile reflex. If your group needs some extra stability, feel free to use Mantra of Concentration. Mantra of Resolve gives you great Condi Cleanse, and Nullfield will give you great AoE boon removal and Condi Cleanse for your team. If you need extra CC, you can swap out 1000 Cuts for Signet of Humility. For the Chaos version of this build, you focus far less on summoning Phantasms, so you can swap out your heal skill for whichever you prefer. Mantra of Recovery is a fantastic option here. Now to touch on our traits. Dueling is all about buffing your illusions and critical damage. Phantasmal Fury gives each of your Phantasm's Fury, which obviously makes them crit more often and cranks your damage. Sharper Images causes your illusions to inflict bleeding on critical hits. This pairs really well with your sword and focus Phantasms. Given that each of your Phantasms hit multiple times, this is a juicy amount of bleeding. Fencer's Finesse will reduce the cooldown of each of your sword skills, and will give you a stacking ferocity buff whenever you use a sword skill. Superiority Complex is a massive buff to your critical hit damage, which really pushes this version of the build more towards a hybrid damage style, rather than just straight Condi. The Master Fencer trait also allows you to upkeep a decent amount of fury on your team as well, so that's nice. The Illusions line is all about buffing your shatters, now Bladesongs, and your Phantasms. Shatterstorm turns your F1 shatter into an ammo skill with 2 charges, so you can shatter more often. Compounding Power is more or less a permanent damage buff as it triggers and stacks whenever you generate illusions or blades. Maim the Disillusioned will grant you extra torment on each shatter, and Phantasmal Force will crank the damage of each of your Phantasms the more stacks of might you have, and grant you might when your Phantasms turn into blades. Taking the Virtuoso trait line will turn any clones you would normally summon into blades and contain some absolute banger traits. Jagged Mind will cause blade attacks you use to inflict bleeding on critical hits, another reason 100% crit chance is important. It will also heal you for 3% of the condition damage you inflict, so the more damage you do, the more survivable you are. This trait is one of the main reasons Condi Virtuoso is so busted as a DPS build. This level of baked-in survivability is insane. Deadly Blades will cause all blade attacks to inflict vulnerability. It will also grant you a damage buff for 5 seconds after you use a Bladesong skill. Because of this trait, we want to be using a Bladesong skill at least every 5 seconds to keep up this buff. Phantasmal Blades will cause your Phantasms to launch a blade at your enemies when they are finished attacking. This synergizes with all the traits that buff our blades and make our blade attacks do bleeding. More bleeding stacks is the point here. Quiet Intensity causes Fury to give us increased critical chance. This allows us to take less precision from our gear in order to hit 100% crit chance. You'll also gain Ferocity based on your Vitality, so you'll want to run a tier 10 Jadebot core for that extra Vitality. Here, more Vitality just means more damage. Bloodsong will cause our bleeding to inflict 25% more damage, which is a massive buff. And for every 5 stacks of bleeding we inflict, also generate another blade. This means we can shatter even more often. Like I mentioned before, running the Chaos version of this build results in slightly lower damage, but also greatly simplifies the rotation. It also reduces the focus on summoning Phantasms, so we'll need to swap around some of our traits accordingly. Method of Madness will cause you to drop a lesser Chaos Storm when you use a heal skill. We take this because there aren't really any better options for a DPS build in this line, although the other traits in this line can increase your survivability quite a bit, so feel free to take them if you're struggling. Illusionary Membrane will grant you 10% extra condition damage if you have regeneration on you. Because of this trait, and another one later on, it's really important that someone in your subgroup provides this for you, else it's 10% lower damage for you, so keep that in mind. Chaotic Potency will just give you extra condition damage, nice. Chaotic Persistence will give you a nice chunk of condition damage and duration when you're affected by regeneration. So again, regeneration is super important for this build. Chaotic Interruption will recharge one of your weapon skills at random by 5 seconds. This is just a nice bit of quality of life. You can be flexible for the Grandmaster line in Chaos, so feel free to take Bountiful Disillusionment if you'll prefer some extra boons when using your Bladesongs. Because we don't focus on summoning Phantasms with the Chaos build, Phantasmal Force in the Illusions line is kind of wasted. So swap it out for Master of Fragmentation for some buffs to your Bladesong skills instead. Similarly, Phantasmal Blades in the Virtuoso line is not as useful anymore, so feel free to swap it out for Sharpening Sorrow. This will grant you Fury when you use Bladesong Sorrow, your F2 skill, and give you extra condition duration when you have Fury. The Dueling and Chaos versions of these builds each have different gear requirements due to the extra stats you get from your traits in the Chaos version. This also leads to some different sigil choices for each build. I've also not used any infusions for this build. A lot of Condi Virtuoso builds include some extra precision infusions to nab some extra crit chance. Personally, this complicates gearing a bit too much for my liking, so we're not touching infusions today. If you want to see what gear you need if you consider infusions, have a play with the Discretized Gear Optimizer. It will show you the way and the light. Easiest one out of the way, always take Runes of the Crate in either build. This rune gives you bonus condition damage as well as an extra 50% bleeding duration. This makes the entire build function. For sigils, each build will use a Sigil of Earth for the extra bleeding on critical hits. The Dueling version will take a Sigil of Agony for the extra bleeding duration, given it gets less Condi duration from its traits. The Chaos version instead can take Sigil of Bursting. Again, it's got the extra Condi duration from various traits, so it can afford to crank its condition damage instead. For food, take bowls of fancy leek and potato soup. This will give you extra precision and condition damage. For utility, use Toxic Focusing Crystals. These are generally the best in slot utility for most condition damage builds. For the gear stats, there's going to be a rather odd mix of Rampages, Vipers, and Sinister gear. This is also we can hit 100% crit chance, or as close as possible at least, and max out our bleeding duration. I've listed the specific pieces you need on the screen for each build variant. I've also included links to each of the builds in the description below, so you can always reference exactly what you need for each version. Finally, we're at the rotation. One thing I really like about this build is that it doesn't have a fixed rotation. Like Condition Damage Scourge, another build I love and will be covering later, you instead have a priority list of skills, which determines what order you press your buttons. Once you've carved the priority list into your mind hole, you can easily adapt it to any situation, and never get lost in a tricky rotation again. We have an ideal opener for fights, but after that we just fall back into our priority list. First up, let's go through our priority list and the rules for which skills to use and when. For our skills, excluding our Phantasms, our list of skills to work our way down is 1000 Cuts, Bladesong Sorrow, Bladesong Harmony. Always try to avoid building up 2 charges, this is a waste of a perfectly good skill. Blade Call, Unstable Blade Storm, and Blade Turn Requiem. Other than that, fill your time with dagger auto attacks. Also, make sure you only use your Bladesong skills when you have 5 blades stocked for maximum damage. Now for our Phantasms. Other than this priority list, our rotation is controlled by our Phantasm cooldowns. On the Dueling build, your Phantasms slap, so you're going to want to use them as much as possible. So we'll always start out on Dagger Sword, use your Phantasmal Swordsman, swap to Dagger Focus, use Phantasmal Warden, Use Signet of the Ether to recharge our Phantasmal Warden. Use Phantasmal Warden again. As soon as you can, swap back to Sword. Use Phantasmal Swordsman. Twiddle your thumbs for a while until you can summon Phantasmal Swordsman again. Summon it, swap back to Dagger Focus, repeat this until the boss is dead. When you combine this Phantasm summoning order with the skill priority list, guess what? You've nailed the rotation. Now for some other useful tips, always swap back to Sword as soon as possible. Only delay weapon swapping so you can squeeze out that extra Sword Phantasm. Try and group your skills together whenever possible. This means instead of using Dagger 2, Auto Attack, F2, Auto Attack, Dagger 3, and so on, try and line up your skills so that you don't need to use an auto attack between them. This will mean that you cancel less auto attacks between skills and waste less perfectly good damage. It also makes the rotation feel smoother, so that's a plus. Always try and use a Bladesong skill every 5 seconds to upkeep the Deadly Blades buff. You want to use your Signet of Illusions to recharge your Bladesongs when your F2 is off cooldown, and a long cooldown at that, and when you have no F1 charges left. Like I mentioned before, if you're a bit slow in the rotation, you may not get a chance to use this skill as often as you need. In that case, swap it for something else. The passive on the Signet is not hugely useful. For the opening burst, use Sword 5, Weapon Swap, use F1 and 1000 cuts during the cast, Dagger 2, Dagger 3, Focus 5 and F2, use Signet of the Ether and Focus 5 again, use F1 again, use Signet of Illusions to recharge your Bladesong skills. From here, you can just fall into the Phantasm summoning order and skill priority list. If you're using the Chaos build, you don't even need to worry about swapping weapons. Just follow the skill priority list we went through, spam Torch 4 off cooldown, and profit. And with that, you've now completely mastered what I'm going to go right ahead and argue is the best DPS build in the game at the moment. This build is easy to play, does insane damage, is uber survivable, has all the juicy Mesmer goodness, and has enough blocks and distorts to make tank builds blush. Remember back to when Power Mechanist was the top of the DPS pile, was super easy to play and everyone was mad? Well, this is better than that. So go log in, grab your Mesmer, make this build, and watch as your DPS troubles just wash away. Thank you all so much for watching. It's been an absolute pleasure to bring you these build guides, and we're nowhere close to done. Leave a like and subscribe for some more sweet Guild Wars 2 content, and I'll catch you all next time.